Good morning. We're going to have a panel that we've never delved this deeply into the subject before, that is books as a subject. We have a panel this morning that will be moderated by Michael Krasny, who probably needs no introduction to at least 90% of you here. I like to think that Michael Krasny, we were just talking about it, we're both Badgers from the University of Wisconsin. Go Badgers. Michael, as you know, enjoys the largest radio signal in Northern California and possibly the largest talk radio audience, I would think, possibly in the state. What can I say? You know what he's done. He's interviewed just about everybody around and almost every leader of every country who passes through town. So with that, he's the obvious person, given his background with a PhD in the English language, to moderate this panel. Michael Krasny.
Thank you, Lowell. I would begin by saying how pleased I am to be here, were it not for the fact that I realized I locked my keys in my car. But notwithstanding, I am actually pleased to be here. And I want to say initially, by the way, just a quick correction, my PhD, not that it matters in the long run very much, but it's in English literature. So I teach literature, and I say that as a segue to the fact that you have a very distinguished panel here, and I'm honored to be with them. But you probably ought to know the fact that a lot of the thing that brings them together here, and we'll hear from each of them individually in terms of the way they approach investigative journalism and think about it being published, is to have a strong narrative drive, to have a story that really grabs you and that you as a reader have a stake in, and it can be at the same time, of course, revelatory and uplifting and all of those things that we hope we get out of books. There is, it seems to me, common ground, at least in that respect. Would we had time to talk about the difficulties in the publishing industry, because I'm sure that each of them who has made their mark can give some wisdom on that, and they may indeed in their talks to you. But let me, without any further ado, tell you who we're fortunate enough to have here on this panel this morning. And I'll begin with Diana Enriquez, who is right here to my right, my immediate right, the author of the New York Times bestseller, The Wizard of Lies, Bernie Madoff and the Death of Trust. And she's been a writer for the New York Times since 1989 and was previously a staff writer for Barron's magazine. I heard her talking about all the crossover that was involved in writing for Barron's before we actually sat down here this morning. She was a Wall Street correspondent also for the Philadelphia Inquirer and an investigative reporter for the Trenton, New Jersey Times back in the year when they didn't even know that Chris Christie was who he was. 2005, Diana was actually a finalist for a Pulitzer Prize, and she won a George Polk Award, which is quite a revered award in itself, and also won the Worth Bingham Prize for Investigative Reporting and Harvard's Goldsmith Prize for her 2004 series, which exposed insurance and investment ripoffs of young military consumers. She was also a member of the New York Times team that was a Pulitzer finalist for its coverage of financial crisis back in 2008. And she's the author of three previous books, The Machinery of Greed, Fidelity's World, and The White Sharks of Wall Street. She lives in Hoboken, and we're delighted to have her here. Please give a warm welcome.
Thank you.
Immediately next to Diana is my friend Adam Hochschild, whose writing has usually focused on human rights and social justice. We became friends back in the days when he was involved in Mother Jones Magazine, which he was one of the founders of. Wrote a book called Halfway Home, and I interviewed him about that book, how many years ago was that, Adam?
25. No, longer.
I shouldn't do that to you.
27.
It's a memoir of, as it's subtitled, Father and Son, very touching and tender portrayal of his father and his relationship, and it was published, back in 1986. It was followed by The Mirror at Midnight, which is a subtitle of South African Journey, and The Unquiet Ghost, Russians Remember Stalin, and Finding of the Trap Door, essays, portals, travels, collects shorter pieces from several decades. I'll tell you a little bit more about Adam. His book, King Leopold's Ghost, is probably one of the books that really made him most famous, the story of greed, terror, and heroism in colonial Africa. It won a J. Anthony Lucas Award in the United States and the Duff Cooper Prize in England. Bury the Chains, also an extraordinary book. Prophets and Rebels in the Fight for to Free an Empire's Slaves, which is actually a history of the British anti-slavery movement. This is what Adam does. He takes things that sometimes don't have a lot of light put on them, and I think probably our panelists would agree that that is a good harbinger to finding your way in the world of investigative journalism. That was a finalist for the National Book Award back in 2005 and won the Los Angeles Times Book Prize. And for the body of his work, he's received a number of awards from the Lannan Foundation, the American Historical Association, the American Academy of Arts and Letters. His latest book, To End All Wars, A Story of Loyalty and Rebellion, 1914 to 1918, which is about those in World War I, that terrible, stupid, and horrendous war that refused to fight. So again, shining light on something that really didn't have light shined on it before. And that was a finalist for the National Book Critics Circle Award. His books have been translated into 14 languages, and he has written for the New Yorker, Harper's, the Atlantic, New York Review of Books, Granta, New York Times Magazine, and many other publications, and was one of the co-founders of Mother Jones, as I said, but also teaches here at the Graduate School of Journalism, University of California, Berkeley. Welcome, Adam Hochschild. And we have two more panelists that it's my pleasure to introduce, and as I said, this is certainly a high-flying panel and a distinguished panel. Seth Rosenfeld's work is probably well known to many of you. He's a freelance journalist in San Francisco, author of the best-selling book Subversives, the FBI's War on Student Radicals, and Reagan's Rise to Power, which was published by Farrar, Straus and Giroux. Subversives actually traces the secret document history, the secret involvement history of the Federal Bureau of Investigation with three, I suppose you can call them iconic figures at Berkeley during the 1960s. The then ambitious neophyte politician, Ronald Reagan, the fierce but fragile radical, Mario Savio, and the liberal University of California president, Clark Kerr. And these stories all, of course, intersect and profiles, but that's how the book is framed. And through these converging narratives, which I think Seth likes to say, give you some real holy shit moments, to quote him, he tells a pretty dramatic and disturbing story about the operations of the FBI. Surveillance, illegal break-ins, infiltration, planted news stories, poison pen letters, all the things you in Berkeley have known about for years before anybody else did, of course, and secret detention lists, and reveals in the book very important information about covert operations led by J. Edgar Hoover and the FBI that helped ignite student protest here and really across the country, across the world, one might say. Also helped to undermine the Democrats and benefit Reagan personally and politically, and at the same time, the vivid nature of what Seth evokes in his book about the life of Berkeley in the early 60s is really quite gripping and engaging, and he shows how the university community became a battleground in an epic struggle between the government and free citizens. Please welcome Seth Rosenfeld. And finally, it's my pleasure to introduce Priscilla Plainton to you, and each of our participants will speak 3 minutes. I've already been given license by Lowell Bergman to say if you go over that, you'll get the hook. We'll try to keep it to 3 minutes as much as we can. No filibustering. Sorry I had to put that in, Priscilla, before introducing you, but let me do that now. That was not meant in any way to be directed. We're lucky to have Priscilla with us this morning. She's executive editor of nonfiction for Simon & Schuster. And since joining Simon & Schuster, she's acquired a range of books, including best-selling biographies of Michelle Obama and Ted Kennedy, the history of the President's Club, the memoir of an anxiety sufferer, the secret diary of one of the most powerful communists in China. I mentioned all of these, all of them became bestsellers, as well as books that cover a wide range: history, politics, science, religion, economics, and American society in general. Previously, Priscilla Payton was deputy managing editor of Time magazine and joined Time back in 1989 as a reporter, went on to edit every section of the magazine, quite impressive, and served longest as Time's Nation editor, responsible for all political and domestic news. And in that role, she oversaw Time's investigation of campaign finance scandals, which won a prestigious Goldsmith Investigative Journalism Prize. She also served as Time's executive editor before being appointed deputy managing editor, which made her the highest-ranking woman editor in the history of that loose publication, as I like to call it, LUCE. Prior to joining Time, She worked for the Atlanta Journal and Constitution, the Washington Post, and the Berkshire Eagle in Pittsfield, Massachusetts. So please give a warm welcome to Priscilla Cook. And I think it's safe for me to say, without any even hint of hyperbole, that you have a pretty incomparable panel here. And the way we're going to work this is each is going to give you kind of an overview of really the subject that we're dealing with here, which is publishing investigative reporting and getting published. Give you some wisdom, give you some of the wisdom particularly from their own experiences, and then I will feel free to engage them after each is in seriatim presented, and then I will engage you and we'll have Q&A. So, Diana, if I could begin with
Terrific.
you.
I'm comforted to see so many people here. I know Lowell was figuring that anyone crazy enough to want to write books was crazy enough to get up at this hour after last night's party, so I appreciate your being here. I want to talk about the three problems that it seems to me are part of converting muckraking into books. There's the practical problems, which are hard, and then there's the creative problems, which are harder, and then there's the existential problem, which is the hardest of all. The practical problems, three of the biggest ones I confronted were, what do you do about dialogue? Where do you get it? How do you find it? And how do you use it? You have to be scrupulous with your reputation here in building dialogue. So as you do your reporting and you're gathering your research, you have to look for every opportunity that you can to find something you can turn into dialogue. Transcripts, letters, emails, everything that shows up as exhibits and lawsuits and discovery in cases. So plan for dialogue from the beginning of your research. You need to be able to reconstruct scenes. You can use Google Earth to see what a neighborhood looks like or what it looked like 10 years ago. You can go online and discover what the weather was the day he was arrested. But you need to do that kind of visual and cinematic reconstruction. And then organizing your material. Don't even think about starting unless you can build a master chronology. The one I used for the Madoff book with the help of my researcher, we never printed it out because we had no idea how many pages it would run to, but it was color-coded by the principal players. So, Bernie was red and, the SEC was green and that sort of thing. And that helps you organize your material. So those are just some of the practical problems that you'll hit. Then there are the creative problems. The biggest one of which, particularly for us muckrakers, is the cluttered stage. You've got so many people in this story. You can't put them all in. I happened to reread Jonathan Whitney's great The Fountain Pen Conspiracy, one of the trailblazing efforts to turn reporting into books. And, there's too many people on the stage. I loved Jonathan dearly, as we all did, but you have to make some choices. Who stays in the story? Who is a bit player? The FBI agent, not by name. So you need to clear the stage and determine who your cast of characters is. You have to establish your point of view. How much is the reader going to hear from the author? How much are you going to be providing context? And how much are you going to be arguing your case in your own voice? Figure that one out. And then you need to find the narrative arc. As was said earlier, you need to figure out where you're going to come into this story, where you're going to travel, and where you're going to end it. What is its beginning, end, and middle? So those are the practical and the creative problems. Then there's the existential problem. Is this a book at all? Can this be turned into a book? And I submit that not every great project of muckraking is a great book. And I've written some books that probably shouldn't have been books. So I think one good way to look at whether or not it's a book is to see if you can see the misty shape of some kind of archetypal story from human culture in your project. Whether it's, when we go to an editor and say, I've got this great Cinderella story, or this is a real David and Goliath story, our editor knows immediately what we're talking about because those are archetypal stories in human culture, and there are gazillions of them, but if you can't see the shape or the outline of a Dr. Jekyll, Mr. Hyde, that might be Mr. Bernie Madoff, or The Sorcerer's Apprentice, which I think is the misty story behind Too Big to Fail, Andrew Ross Sorkin's great book. If you can't see the misty shape of one of those archetypes, you may not have a book. You certainly will have a better book if you can see that archetype. So if it's there, fabulous. The first night I heard about Bernie Madoff, King Lear came into my mind. Here is this man so respected who was actually a fraud, betrayed in turn by his own sons. So I was hooked by Nightfall, but you need to be able to see what those bigger stories are. Okay, say it is a book. You see that outline. What's it really about? What is it really fundamentally about? My book is not about Bernie Madoff. It's not about the Madoff scandal. It's not even about Ponzi schemes. It is about that tragic human gift for self-deception. The lies we tell ourselves, the lies Bernie told himself, the lies his investors told themselves, the lies Congress told itself about what it was doing at the SEC's lies to itself about what it could accomplish. It was about self-deception. So if you can get down into the roots of your story and figure out what it's really about, then maybe you've got a book, and maybe it's going to be a better book. And then finally, you got to figure out whether you're willing to do what it takes to sell that book, which means turning your life into a perpetual book tour. No other way around it. Don't think that this book is just going to flutter on its own little beautiful wings up to the top of the bestseller list. You have to be willing to market and market and market. Build a platform in social media for your expertise. Put your name and face out there. Anytime a Ponzi scheme gets mentioned in the continental United States, I want to be someone they think of. So you have to be willing to do an amazing amount of work to market that book once you truly believe in it. That's my 3-minute tour of the Diana Henriquez book lessons.
Thank you, and thank you for being so cogent. Just a quick follow-up question. I think using the archetypes as you did as a standard of measure, didn't you wind up realizing that the Madoff story that you wrote was finally about the emperor without any clothes?
Well, actually, yes. You may find more than one archetype in your story, depending on your point of view. For me, when I was in Bernie's head, when I was writing the Madoff arc of the story, to me it was clearly Dr. Jekyll and Mr. Hyde. It was this man, the duality of this respected statesman who genuinely shaped the modern stock market. I mean, no puffery about that. He was a seminal figure in the development of NASDAQ and over-the-counter trading, and had this dark, desperate character inside him. So for him, it was Dr. Jekyll and Mr. Hyde. But you're absolutely right. When I was telling the story of the investors, the people who followed him, it was the Emperor's New Clothes. It was that culture of belief that spread up around Bernie. So you may see two alternating archetypes in your story. It may not be just the one, but you're looking for those larger cultural thoughts, the elements that are in the story for that.
Thank you. Adam, can I go right to you? Adam Hawkshill.
Well, I'm sort of an imposter at this conference because unlike almost all the rest of you, the people that I'm investigating, people and events I'm investigating are usually people and things from 100 or 200 years ago. And in many ways, that's a lot easier than being an investigative journalist in the present. Nobody expels you from the country. Nobody threatens to deny you a visa next time. Nobody makes death threats. Nobody sues you for libel. Nobody slams a door in your face. And another, nobody, once your writing comes out, says, "But I talked to you all afternoon and you didn't use a single word I said." So there are many advantages to writing about things farther back in the past, which is usually what I do, except for every once in a while I take a break and revert to my previous life as a magazine journalist. I think the main thing that I try to think about when I write a book, or for that matter when I write a magazine article, is what's my narrative strategy? Because if you're writing something long, especially something as long as a book, you're not bringing news to the reader in a way that's going to make them, read on no matter how badly it's written. If I'm writing a piece, for tomorrow morning's paper that says U.S. and Canada declare war on each other, I know people will read to the end of that story no matter how badly it's written. But if I'm writing something 300 pages long, I have to have a narrative strategy. And I think that what took me a while to realize is that my own interest or fascination with the subject did not constitute a narrative strategy. And I think a lot of writers don't realize that, and it took me a while to realize that. you have to have a way of telling the story that's going to hook people in. Take, for example, my last book, To End All Wars. If I told you I'm writing a book that's primarily about British conscientious objectors in World War I, something which I've long been fascinated with, you're going to sort of nod politely and move on to the next book on the shelf. But if I told you, hey, here are a couple of people from my next book. One of them is a rambunctious, fiery pacifist in Britain during the First World War who traveled up and down the country speaking against the war, went to jail 4 times, wrote the best-selling anti-war pamphlet, visited war resistors in prison, and she was very fond of her younger brother, who was commander-in-chief on the Western Front. Then you might pick up the book. Now, when I was researching this period, the First World War and people who refused to fight in it, which had so long fascinated me, it took me a year and a half of reading before I discovered this pair. And during that year and a half, I was thinking the whole time, I am never going to find a pathway through this subject that allows me to engage my fascination with it and will draw in a reader who doesn't share that fascination. The moment I hit this amazing brother and sister combination, and I should just pause and say parenthetically, each of them are people who've had several biographies written of them, and none of the biographers seemed interested in that relationship. It was military people who did biographies of the general, the field marshal, and they were sort of a little embarrassed that he had this weird pacifist sister. It was militant feminists who did biographies of the woman, and they were a little embarrassed that she had this general brother, so they were sort of just mentioned in passing. Anyway, the moment I found them, then I suddenly realized divided families. That's how I'll tell my story. And that became my strategy. Then the next step is a casting call. Okay, I'm holding auditions. Who's going to be in the cast? And there, at least when you're dealing with history, and if you're dealing with more contemporary subjects as well, I think it all depends on whose voices can you get. When it's historical people, it's a matter of who left diaries, records, other documents behind them. And if, these documents reveal an interesting and hopefully conflicted in some way person, that's where those are the kinds of things that constitute audition material where I'm kind of picking my cast. Then there's the matter that Diana mentioned of scenes, because I think when you're carrying people through a narrative, whatever it's about, history or anything else, you need a succession of scenes. Our life unfolds in scenes. Movies, novels unfold in scenes. What are going to be, the scenes that I can build? And there it depends on, can I get a lively recollection of a scene from one or ideally several people who took part in it. And I got very excited because the book I'm working on now, I've got a scene that begins it where I knew that 4 of the participants had left written records of this scene. And then as I began doing more research, I realized, no, there were actually 6 or 7. Then my heart began to sink because these recollections, I realized, were somewhat contradictory and said slightly different things. So I'm sort of trying to sort that all out. But that character, scene, and I think the third and last principal building block of any kind of narrative is plot. I mean, these are what my high school English teacher told me to look for in a novel: characters, scenes, and plot. And by plot, I mean, how can you tell a story in a way where you withhold crucial pieces of information? What's going to happen? How can you pause at a suspenseful moment, have the reader wondering, and then pick up another strand of the plot and get them interested in that? Pause that as a suspenseful moment. The old line from the description of the Western, the stagecoach gets robbed, then meanwhile, back at the ranch. So I do a diagram of a book that has those meanwhile back at the ranch moments all plotted out, where I can pause with one character's adventures at some suspenseful point. He or she has just received a piece of news or something, and then pick up another character. You know, there's nothing new here. It's the way Shakespeare wrote plays. It's the way every drama on TV is written. It's the way novels are written. In fact, I'll just end by saying I think people who want to write these sorts of books, especially investigative books, where you might not necessarily have a lot of readers wanting to get the dirt on a particular person or company or whatever to begin with, you have to pay extra attention to these novelistic devices. And I don't mean, unlike novelists, we're not allowed to make anything up, but you have to pay extra attention to how they tell the story. And I think there's probably more to be learned about that from reading fiction than reading nonfiction. So I'll stop there.
Well, thank you, Adam. I'm just struck again as a literature professor how it dovetails with ideas of literature of different genres, stage and character and plot and so forth. But you have to be true to the facts, and sometimes that can be a challenge, a formidable challenge. That's a whole other panel, though. And I would call you an investigative historian, by the way. I think that's the label I would hand. Just one quick question, though. You get so involved in the research, and a lot of novelists have told me through the years, many novelists, that right here in Berkeley, for example, Michael Chabon said he loves to do research to such a great degree that sometimes the writing of the novel becomes secondary, and the research eclipses, just in his interest and what galvanizes him, the whole task of writing the novel. That happened to you?
Absolutely. I mean, I could do research forever. I could hole up in a library and look at books other people have written in an archive and read through old letters and diaries and documents, because it's so much easier than writing. You know, people have occasionally asked me if I use a research assistant, and I say, are you kidding? I don't want to give away this fund to anybody else. What I want is a writing assistant where I can say, you know, here's a bunch of half-baked ideas, here's a big stack of books, here's some documents I copied because they looked fascinating to me. You organize it, I'll do the first draft. I'll take over after that.
Thank you again, Adam. Let's go to Seth Rosenfeld next. Seth, if you would.
Oh, thank you. Well, first, I want to say that everything that Adam and Diana have said resonates with my own experience. And I think one of the difficulties for me, and perhaps for many of you who are contemplating such a enterprise, is making the transition from writing for daily journalism or newspapers or even magazines to writing for a book format. How do you convert those stories? It's one thing to go through a stack of documents and find the scoops or the nuggets and write a hard news story, but it's another thing to build a narrative. And a narrative is really the key thing in a book, even if it's a book that's, you know, very newsy. My book, Subversives, grew out of some newspaper stories I did over a period of 20 years. And I had a stack of FBI documents that I'd obtained through the Freedom of Information Act, and I went through them in chunks and wrote stories as I did. So one of the first stories was about the FBI investigating the free speech movement. And then a second story some years later was about the FBI focusing on Mario Savio, who was a leader of the free speech movement, and he was a fascinating character. So it had a somewhat different shape. And then a subsequent story looked at the FBI's investigations of Savio's nemesis, Clark Kerr. So in doing this research, it gradually dawned on me by doing these different stories that I had three really strong characters who would represent this, what to me was an incredible clash that happened here at Berkeley in the 60s. A clash between Savio and the rising student movement, between Clark Kerr, who was the traditional Cold War liberal Democrat, and the rising Ronald Reagan. So I had these documents that showed the FBI's relationship with Reagan and with these different things. And I did these stories, but what would make that a book? I mean, one of the questions editors put to me at various points was, why isn't this just a magazine story? And I think you have to get past that threshold question. And I think the answer to it, at least in part, is that you're writing about bigger themes. If it's not an archetypal story, it has to have bedrock themes that cut across the time you're writing about, that go back to the ages, if you will, such as free speech, or civil liberties, or fundamental rights. So conceptualizing, when you're thinking about turning your reporting into a book, you really need to conceptualize in terms of who are the main characters and what is the narrative, what is the conflict between them, and how are you going to illustrate that conflict. It requires doing a different kind of reporting than you might do for daily newspapers. You need much more context, you need much more information about who these people are as people. As Adam said, hopefully they're complex people who are struggling with things as they're moving through time. When I first tried to sell my book back in the mid-90s, I was rejected, and I made several mistakes, which I would warn you about. I had gone through a bunch of the documents, I wrote a proposal, and through a friend of a friend, I was told to go see a particular agent in New York, so I did that. And she sent me down the street to see a particular editor. And the editor took the time, he was very gracious, he took the time to read my proposal, but he didn't like it at all. And I found out later that he had actually edited one of Reagan's biographies. So you really do need to do a certain amount of due diligence in picking an agent and then picking an editor. And you do that just through your reporting and talking to people. You want to find an agent who has a track record of handling investigative books, and then find a publishing house and an editor who has done those kinds of books. And you can read the acknowledgments in other books and find that out. One of the things that Adam alluded to was the narrative, the power of the narrative. And I think if you're coming from a reporting background, your impulse is to state the facts and stick to the facts and not want to hold stuff back. It's counterintuitive. But you really do need to do that to tell the story, to engage the reader. So there's this kind of conflict between the narrative on the one hand and nuts and bolts reporting on the other hand. Doing a book proposal is a very big part of doing a book. It forces you to answer certain questions and focus. It's what your agent will use when he or she tries to sell the book. I went out and bought a book on how to write a book proposal, and it was actually very helpful. Another thing that comes up is if you don't have your characters actually talking to each other or engaged in hand-to-hand combat, how do you illustrate the conflict between them? And actually something Adam mentioned at another panel here on narrative writing several years ago is you can show that your characters are intentioned towards each other. So Reagan and Savio, to my knowledge, never actually spoke with each other, but they were very much engaged in this dialogue, in this conversation. So I tried to illustrate that by juxtaposing certain moments or quotes from them. And, I think another problem I had in selling my book originally is that the 60s were kind of old news. The FBI spying during the 60s was kind of old news. So what made this, what changed? Well, 9/11 happened. And all of a sudden there was a heightened interest in civil liberties and national security and the clash between those two things. So in my proposal, I said, at a time when many Americans are concerned about the expansion of intelligence powers under the Patriot Act, this book built around the conflicts between legendary characters will serve as a cautionary tale. So I don't talk about 9/11 in my book. I don't mention it. I think I have one reference to the Patriot Act. But the book, even though not explicitly referencing modern times, is very clearly about that. And I tried to show that this was, as Diana mentioned, a story about this sort of epic values, civil liberties, national security. And so the other thing I would mention is you're in for a long haul. It takes longer. It's going to take twice as long as you think. And you really have to like the subject and be interested in it. And finally, just to refer back to something David Fanning said when he was talking about documentary filmmaking, it begins once upon a time, and you're going to know your ending at some point, and then you're going to fill in the things between that. And as he described it in 3 acts, I mean, my book is actually in 3 sections, and that actually works. You're using a very traditional dramatic structure to present the information you've gathered through your investigations. So I think I'll stop there.
Thank you, Seth. It just struck me in a metaphorical sense, because you couldn't have Savio and Reagan necessarily in dialogue since they never talked to each other, and you had to work through that. If you were E.L. Doctorow, you could have. Or if you were Oliver Stone, you could have. There's lies the difference between, I think, good investigative reporting, or what ought to lie the difference, and, say, filmmaking or fiction. And I mention that as a prelude just to asking you, you run into the necessity of fact-checking because of the potential of libel. And could you talk about that just very briefly in terms of what you did to protect yourself or ensure that you wouldn't wind up with that?
Well, it's kind of in a funny position because this book straddles the fence between history on the one hand and journalism on the other hand. Many of the characters are deceased, but many others were still alive and potentially might not be happy with what I was writing about them. So I just used traditional journalism. I took copious notes. I taped interviews with permission whenever I could, multiple sources. And then the entire book was lawyered before it went to press. And I was very grateful to Farrar Straus for doing that.
I felt compelled to ask you after Adam said he didn't have to worry about libel.
So I should just mention I felt very lucky to work with Farrar Straus. They gave me the time to do that, and to work with my agent, Alice Martell, who really loves this kind of story, and really, she's the one who I think in many ways made it happen. So.
Thanks again, Seth. And moving right along, Priscilla, please.
Well, I was going to talk about converting great journalism to books, but I cannot match the eloquence of my co-panelists. So what I'm going to do is talk about why, and be the carnival barker, basically, and make the argument that this is the golden age of converting journalism into great best-selling books. It's not just that somebody like Michael Moss can hit the top of the bestseller list with an expose on essentially how the food industry hooks you, and get inside those meetings, get the memos, and get the dialogue. It's that it's that people like Kate Boo in The Beautiful Forevers, or Rebecca Skloot in The Immortal Life of Henrietta Lacks, if you had told me that a journalist could spend 10 years in an Indian slum and deconstruct the culture of poverty, and that would stay on the bestseller list for a very, very long time, I would have been surprised. I'm not surprised anymore. Same with Rebecca Skloot. The main character is an African-American woman who ends up being exploited by science and medicine, and her book raises tremendous issues about the moral dilemmas that we all need to face as a society. Again, that book has been on the bestsellers for 2 years, and yet it's not what most people think of as the typical bestseller. At this moment in publishing, there's a flood of talent coming in. You can imagine why. Institutions that used to employ journalists don't do that anymore quite so much. There is huge new avenues for journalism to end up, if not inside hardcovers, then inside Kindle singles. And I'll talk a little bit about how you get those to sell, but those are huge, great vehicles for long-form journalism. But also, more and more people are figuring out that there are all kinds of different ways to get your journalism in front of many readers. Of course, we know the tradition of the reconstruct. The reconstruct is what Woodward's perfected many years ago, or I know he's controversial, but he was alone for a long time. In the last 18 months, there have been five reconstructs of the Obama economic team's management of the economic recovery. There used to be basically only one or two people on that terrain. So all kinds of journalists have found ways to support themselves, sort of following the news. There are two kinds of reconstructs. Dave Cullen took 10 years to write Columbine. People thought, what in God's name could he add to that story? He retold it from top to bottom. But then Joby Warrick of the Washington Post took 1.5 years to reconstruct how an Al-Qaeda mole infiltrated the CIA. And that book, A Triple Agent, also was successful. So there are all kinds of different timelines that are possible now for approaching big stories that way. Another genre that's getting more and more attention is what I call the prequel. That's Steve Cole basically coming out with Ghost Wars and saying, well, the 9/11 story starts many, many decades before. Let me bring you up to, the early part of that tragedy. Same with The Looming Tower by Larry Wright. Again, taking years to reconstruct all the moments that have led to 9/11. Another way journalists can make money is there's more and more government officials in the last 20 years that don't go silently into the night but want to tell their story. And we had a bestseller when Neil Barofsky came out with Bailout. These people, whistleblowers, I can tell you, cannot write. They need help. I just bought a book this week by the former chairman of the Nuclear Regulatory Commission. He's going to expose the degree to which that industry is controlled by not the regulatory agency, but the people who make money off of it. Again, I think the facts are going to be great, but he's going to need some help. And there's a way, I think, also to use books to break news for the first time, not just because we can turn on a dime, which we didn't used to be able to do 20 years ago, but because a lot of journalists like the idea of being able to have direct access to the public without any interference, which is what we can do in books. I hired Manuel Royce Franzia to do a biography of Marco Rubio, figuring, the guy's going to be around, maybe we can sell some books over a few years. And as he was reporting it, he was discovering that Marco's biography, as Marco told it, was not accurate. And instead of holding on to those facts, we went to the Washington Post and we said, in exchange for breaking the news on your front page, would you at least credit Simon & Schuster for this kind of journalism, which they did for the first time. So you can actually break news as you write the book. Same with another book we did called Prisoner of the State. It was the secret diary of Zhao Ziyang, who was the premier of China at the height of Tiananmen Square. And because he opposed the crackdown, he was forced to essentially be under house arrest for 20 years. Everybody thought he had died without leaving behind his record of what happened. Those tapes, which he recorded over his grandchildren's opera music, were secreted out of China, and we kept the project secret. But when it appeared, it became a bestseller, even though it is an unreadable book by a communist apparatchik, only because no one had known before that this document existed. So all the China hands and anybody interested in China had this document for the first time. As I said, there's a possibility now, and it's hard to do, but of turning great journalism into instant books. The problem there, and I think Diana made reference to it, is marketing. the ebook world is a book where lots of trees fall in the forests and no one knows about them. So what you need above all in that area is what David Leonard of the New York Times is getting this week, big ads in the New York Times itself saying, go to Kindle, go to Amazon, go to Apple, buy the book. But it is a resource. The Times is collaborating with the Byliner to do more of these. Everybody is getting into the business, and we will find out eventually what the commercial model is for making these books successful. The pros of publishing, now I sound like a carnival barker, I said I would be, is that you do keep the money. You don't have to share it with anybody else. You give your agent 15%. You develop your brand as a journalist, which is something that more and more newspapers are recognizing, and therefore, it used to be 10 years ago, the Times, the Post had a problem with people taking long book leaves. Even the AP now is giving great book leaves to a lot of its reporters, understanding that they need to sort of develop their byline beyond the institution they're attached to. And you do get a marketing machine. Diana's right, you have to market the book yourself, but you at least begin with a set of pros who can sort of put you out there. The cons, of course, of publishing, and it is its weakness, is that there isn't a culture of fact-checking. In fact, there is no fact-checking. That means that you do have to be very careful in the kind of editor that you hire. These are not people with journalism nerve endings, and that means that you do become dependent on the legal department, which is, in my view, not necessarily ending up with the story as truthful as it can be. But in the end, I think that as much as there's been turmoil in journalism, and there will be some turmoil in book publishing, the amount of migration we're seeing from that particular terrain to the book publishing world is a great migration. It's going to continue, and I can't wait to get all of your proposals.
Thank you, Priscilla. We're going to have, we hope, about 10 minutes for questions. So let me just ask you a couple of things, though, because I read an interview you did, and not necessarily to promote one of your books, but when you're talking about different kinds of investigative stories that really touch a nerve or that really get a great deal of reception and interest from the public, as I understand it now, there's a biography in the works of Lady Bird Johnson, which, I mean, the view of her was probably the good wife or something along those lines, but fairly silent and not much of a force behind Lyndon. And this is a book that takes an entirely different historical view, which in itself is a fascinating premise. Yeah.
Thank you so much for mentioning.
Yeah, I'm sorry, but I didn't mean to make this a little plug. Yeah.
It's my labor of love book. Yeah, the historian is a woman called Betty Caroli who came to me and said, you know, I think if we had just moved the camera slightly to the right on the Johnson marriage and the Johnson administration, we would have discovered that Lady Bird was in many ways the political smarts behind Lyndon.
Slightly to the right didn't necessarily mean politically.
Yeah, what I mean is just sort of the Caro camera has been there in a certain spot for many decades, and he's a wonderful historian, but one of the great pleasures of being in book publishing, and my colleagues here have seen that and been part of it, is constantly correcting the record. And we signed up a book a year ago. We finally got approval from the Shriver family to do a book about Eunice Shriver, and we're going to argue, although I'm sure it'll be pulled back a little bit, but if it were up to me right now, I want to argue she was the smartest Kennedy, completely underestimated, and that her legacy of Special Olympics and putting a focus on that population is probably the most enduring one in the Kennedy family. Again, correcting the record a little bit, or at least adjusting it, is a huge source of pleasure for a lot of us. We're even rehabilitating Harding in a few years in a book.
Just one other quick question, since I know you're probably going to get a number of proposals, maybe even from people who are here today. I think you're on record as saying about 80% of even great pieces of journalism probably should be at least, if not an ebook or something like that, maybe a Kindle single or something along those lines rather than a book. And I think this is an important message for many people who think they may have a book, but the reality is there may not be a book there.
Well, I think my three colleagues were the ones to show just how difficult and challenging it is to convert journalism into essentially beautiful nonfiction. And when they talked about the using tricks from fiction to do it, you know, that, you know, as an ex-journalist, I mean, the idea that you could pull on those skills and put them on the page was terrifying to me. So I don't know how these people do it. But it's, I would say that's one challenge. The other challenge is attention span and tone. People who spend $25 on a hardcover don't want to be harangued, and they don't want to have a finger wagged at something. And so you have to find a way to sort of, I think as Michael Moss did, I wish you were my author, in his book, of taking you inside a world and being coldly furious as opposed to hotly furious about the subject you're exposing. And I think a third thing is that, you know, is length. You know, you have to know that the subject is going to have a kind of page-turning thriller quality. And frankly, you know, a lot of journalism has kind of 2 or 3 points and no characters, and that doesn't convert the way these books have into great works.
Well, thanks again to all the panelists, and we have, as I'm told, maybe about 10 minutes, so don't feel inhibited. If you have a question, please come forward and be brief and ask it. Just raise your hand. If you have a question for any of the panelists or for all the panelists, like I said, we have about 10 minutes, and yes, in the back, sir.
Quick question. When you're doing long-form investigative reporting, you're often sort of starting the investigation, as I'm sure, Diana, you did, with a sense that you have a great story, but no idea where you're going. Assuming the characters are still alive, most investigations change radically as you continue down the road. So how does that work with the book business, where you're having to tell them what you're going to do before you do it, and the investigative business, where you discover things as you go along that are sort of game-changing or paradigm-shifting?
Well, I think there's a point at which you know it. You're absolutely right, Steve. There's a point at which you know it's a book, but you don't know the ending yet. So there's no reason I wouldn't think that the proposal couldn't capture that suspense. You know, the Madoff book is not a great example for how to build that into your proposal. I'll defer to my colleagues on the panel for how to do that. But because we knew what had happened, I was covering it for the Times. We knew Bernie was going to be locked up, and that was a book that was sold on a 7-page proposal. I mean, it was not a classic marketing effort. But there's no reason why you cannot emphasize the importance of the topic, the depth of the theme, the sort of archetypal shape of the story, and say we don't know the ending yet. But you'll have some idea. You know, either the court ruling is going to be upheld or it's going to be struck down. If it's upheld, it's groundbreaking new territory for the law. If it's struck down, it's an outrage, and it just shows there's no accountability. So, I mean, you can play with the possibilities, even though you don't know the outcome. I would defer to people, though, who have done more hefty book proposals more recently.
Well, let me actually dovetail on that, and thank you for that question, and ask the other panelists, isn't it particularly Adam and Seth, isn't it important to keep your own curiosity ignited and not necessarily know all the answers before you come to the end of the first draft?
Well, it certainly is. I suspect Seth's answer to this is going to be more interesting than mine because, you know, he acquired the material for his book over, was it 25 years? 25 years of lawsuits against the FBI, so you probably didn't know what you were going to get until the next batch of material came in. But when I'm working with historical stuff farther back than that, I do know how the story ends. And I try to construct the structure of the book and the proposal accordingly. It's one Another advantage of working with stuff that happened 100 or 200 years ago, you can sort of see the whole picture. I think it's probably more difficult when you don't know exactly how the story's going to end and what your material is going to show you.
Yeah, sometimes, at least in my experience, it revealed itself as I went along. In 1996, after suing the FBI for 11 years and already having 250,000 pages, I realized I had forgotten to get a key set of documents. And those were the Reagan documents about the FBI's relationship with Reagan from the very first moment, which for him was in Hollywood, up through the time he was governor. So this led to another FOIA request and another lawsuit, and not knowing exactly what I would get, but being convinced it was crucial to understand this relationship. One other thing I would add, apropos of something we were talking about earlier, novelistic techniques. Many of you are probably familiar with a book called The New Journalism by Tom Wolfe. And it's a great reference because the first part of that book is him talking about applying novelistic techniques to nonfiction writing, and it's very helpful.
I always found it disturbing, though, when I first read Woodward and Bernstein, when suddenly he would be in Nixon's office and suddenly you'd read, Nixon said to himself. I thought, wait a minute, where's the investigation? Where did that come from? That's new journalism. So let's look at this, if we could, from your perspective. I mean, you as an editor have to stay invested and have to keep curious about what you're reading, don't you?
The two books that we acquired that were the most terrifying to me were one book by a ex-Washington Post journalist who decided to write a book about the human terrain program, the first time in the history of the Pentagon that the Pentagon decided that it was going to wage war by essentially attaching itself to social scientists and anthropologists and moving into the field, because that would help them understand who to kill and who not to kill. And if you say to a sales team of reps from Simon & Schuster, I'm going to sell you a book and you're going to go out there and sell a book on a Pentagon program, they sort of start to nod and not pay attention. So it was an experiment, but the result was that Vanessa Gazzari, the author, came back with essentially what could be, what was in terms of how it reads a novel. One of the anthropologists was killed tragically. One of her co-anthropologists was put on trial. The entire Pentagon effort, and in fact the war itself, is essentially put on trial in this book. And it turned out we did hide from the reader until the very end that the anthropologist dies. We kept that out of the first 3 chapters. But in the end, she was able to retrieve a real thriller out of what felt terrifying to me at the outset as a commercial story. And that does happen, but it's, if you don't know the ending, my only technique so far has been to eliminate characters and try to keep it as focused as possible.
If I could just confess that one of the ways I try to deal with the pacing of a story, because as with Adam, I was confronting a public that knew how my story ended. There was no doubt that Bernie was guilty, he was going to go to prison. I mean, they knew the outcome of the story, and so how do you get him to keep turning the page? How many of you know the work of Lee Child, the suspense thriller, the Jack Reacher series? 2-dimensional characters, incredible pacing, and Lee Child's an amazing author. I would write all night long, wake up the next morning, read a couple of chapters of Lee Child, just dip in the middle because you could not possibly afford to get hooked. You had your own book to write. So I would be reading these incomprehensible scenes about people I didn't know to whom horrible things were happening. But I would just read a couple of chapters, and then I would go back and read what I had written the day before and try to keep the pace. I mean, we all know we read our own stories aloud so that we can maintain a rapid pace through them, but we need a pace car. We need somebody that's moving faster than we normally do. And thriller authors are fabulous for doing that. And I found that an amazing way to speed up the pace at which I told my story. So for what it's worth, just don't start these books at the beginning because then you will be hooked.
We have time I'm afraid only for one more, because I'm feeling a great deal of suspense about whether my keys are still in the car.
Hi, I'm just see just how difficult it is to do this, and I'm wondering if whom do you turn to for help along the way, whether that be a book on how to write a book proposal, lead child, or other people?
Well, I found it very useful. I actually referred to books that help you write screenplays. I mean, that probably Chris Vogler's book, The Writer's Journey, was probably one of the most important tools I turned to when I felt I was struggling with the storytelling. The tricks of Hollywood screenwriting are extremely useful to building the scenes and figuring out who your characters are and figuring out what the arc, those 3 chapters are. So I found those very helpful. In terms of people, my sainted husband read this draft 19 times. And if I couldn't keep his attention, I knew I needed to go back and try again. So you need a lot of emotional support. You need people who believe in the project. I was blessed with a fabulous editor at Henry Holt, just absolutely one of the best. So you do need a support network, but there are those were things I turned to make it easier.
There's some wisdom from the rest of you, Adam?
3 things in my case. I haven't read any of the how-to books. There may be some good ones there, but I find I learn the most from people who've done the kind of thing I'm trying to do and did it really well. Whether it's a novelist like Ian McEwan, who just held my attention riveted to the page throughout a novel, a great historian like Barbara Tuchman, who's my greatest heroine. I read books like that. I try to take them apart, diagram them. What's the line of rising and falling suspense? How did they do it? What information did they withhold? I love diagramming things because I think,
Can I add a footnote here? Because you read my book and sent me a diagram, and actually it was very useful. I never thank you for that.
I can't control my diagramitis here. My class here knows about it. And a diagram is like a skeleton. We can stand up because there's a skeleton inside us. You don't see it from the outside. A book holds our attention, if it does, all the way through for 300 or 400 pages, because there's a skeleton in there. You don't see it, but you got to look and see where that skeleton is. Second thing that's been very good for me is I had 10 years as a magazine editor, and every day you are making judgments on stories. Is this story going to hold the reader's attention? Did it come in at 5,000 words when it really should be 1,000 words? Or in this 1,000-word piece, is there a 5,000-word story? And is it more, worth publishing, more suspenseful, more important than all the other stories in our hopper? Very good training. And finally, I would say, use your friends. If you look at the acknowledgments to my books, you'll find an appalling number of people listed who have been enlisted to read the manuscript. I give it to lots of friends, anybody who's willing, and I say, tell me where you got bored. Tell me where you got confused.
It's kind of tips for the trade. Can you pick up here, Seth, and talk about what's influenced you or what can be helpful to others?
Yes, there are a couple books that I found helpful just in terms of narrative writing. Stewart's book, Follow the Story, John Franklin's book, I think it's called Writing for Story. And also other books that you've read that you like, that whether it's a novel or a nonfiction work, very important to think of those. You read them as a reader, but you also have to read them with kind of X-ray vision and see the hidden structure, as Adam was talking about, diagramming. And a traditional book proposal actually has a section, there's several sections to it. One is an overview, summary of what your book is, what the competitive titles are and how your book is different, potential markets that might be interested in your book. So I tried to really aim mine in 3 different directions for people who are curious about Reagan, people who are curious about the FBI, people who were wondering, about the 60s in some way. I thought all those might be potential markets. There's a table of contents In my case, it was 100, the table of contents and then an outline, which ran to 100 pages. So I really tried to have the structure in hand before I pitched the book. And then you elaborate. How is your book different than similar books or books on similar subjects that are out there already? So you need to go to bookstores and look at these books and think in those terms and be able to distinguish. So I think all that helps in your focusing on your own project.
Priscilla?
I'm going to answer it from the point of view of the buyer, which is there is a certain author that will come to you that is doing the book because it's a resume moment. And the thing I think that makes great books is people who have to get up every morning and write that book, that it is in them, they can't help themselves, it's all they want to do, it's all they think about. That's the kind of author you're looking for. The other kind of author you're looking for is someone who doesn't say to you, and I can get this manuscript to you in 12 months. My radar goes off on that because I think, really? It's hard. It should take longer than that. Rebecca Skloot and Kate Boo, 10 years in the making. I know that's a little scary because the advances don't always cover that kind of effort, but believe it or not, the industry rewards that kind of diligence and passion. The third thing I would do is hire someone who is really lit up by what you want to do, because that passion is going to be what he or she translates to the sales team when she or he has to get up and say, you have to convince Barnes & Noble to take thousands of copies of this book. They have to be able to translate that passion inside their company and then to all the people that can support the book outside of it.
We'll just add one quick thing. Thank you all. Back when I had different dreams, I took a scriptwriting course when I was at the University of Wisconsin and a Badger, as Lowell mentioned earlier. And the very successful teacher, I mean, who had, remember these shows like The Man from U.N.C.L.E. and The Girl from U.N.C.L.E. and Dr. Kildare, and those were all his invention, and he wrote all the scripts for them. He said the more congealed you can be, the more concise you can be in terms of the pitch. And I discovered during that course that Star Trek was actually pitched as Wagon Train in Space. If you can do those kinds of nuggets, you're really, and getting back to the archetype which we started with. I want to thank the panelists for really a terrific presentation. And thanks to you and my friend Lowell Bergman.
Thank you. Go find your keys.
Yeah, you bet.
Are there any, I forgot how to steal a car.
You're talking about your iniquitous youth.
Yeah, right.
Thank you.
We're going to take a 15-minute break, and I wanted to thank again the panelists because it was a great introduction. I did have one question, but maybe we can talk about that privately, which is, how much money do you give out to work for 10 years on a book?
Not enough.
Okay. Thank you again.